President Joe Biden has visited Angola this week, his only trip to sub-Saharan Africa during his presidency. This visit is part of an effort to underscore the US's commitment to Africa in the face of growing competition with China. Well, notably, Biden is the first American president to travel to the region since 2015. But what does it really signify? We're joined by Dr. Jakkie Cilliers, head of the African Futures and Innovation Program at the Institute of Security Studies in South Africa. Hi, Dr. Cilliers. Thank you so much for joining us.
Linda, thanks very much for the invitation.
So, is this visit too little, too late? His absence from Africa throughout his term suggests that they didn't prioritize the continent.
Africa is not a priority in the US, and it is a priority only in terms of competition with China. Trade with Africa, American trade with Africa was overtaken by China in, I think, 2013. And while US investment in Africa is steadily declining over year on year, that with China, of course, is increasing. There is the issue of critical minerals. There is the issue of, as I said, competition with China in Africa for the next big global future market. But Africa struggles for relevance in Washington. And this is a problem. And I think with a very transactional President Trump coming in, the question is, what can Africa, South Africa in particular, but others in Africa, what can we offer the US that will represent a business case for investment and engagement? And that probably is very much around Africa as the next big future market, particularly for information technology, artificial intelligence, and of course, as a source of critical minerals, although much of that is refined in China and not in the US. So I think that those issues are going to be pertinent when we look towards the next period, when South Africa also is chairing the G20, which will see President Trump visit South Africa in November of next year. Now that's interesting because that would mean that Trump would require, well, we'll see if he comes, but that will require an engagement on the continent, which otherwise may not have been the case. And then the US takes over in November of next year from South Africa as president of the G20. And there's always a degree of continuity between the current G20 president and the next G20 president. So those are all positives for South Africa and may manage to lift the interest in South Africa and in Africa.
Well, the US has seen its influence in Africa wane with the closure of its military base in Niger and the removal of its forces from Chad. Well, with no significant military presence in the Sahel, which is a region of conflict, can they turn this around? Would Trump be interested in turning this around?
So Trump and the populists are not really, they're in one sense isolationist. They don't want American foreign military adventures or engagement. Remember that he withdrew the American soldiers from Somalia and so on. So so that on the one hand, I don't think we will see additional security engagement in Africa. On the other hand, it's also true that for the Russians that have now, in a sense, replaced the Americans in the Sahelian countries, they don't really represent an alternative. They are there very much in their own interests. They're basically busy continuing with a proxy war against the Europeans and the Americans from Ukraine in the Sahel. And this, of course, is a problem because we, again, are ending up as a battlefield for others, which is a problem. But I don't think this will play into this will be a major issue. I think what is important is our business interests and what can the US gain from Africa. And there the story is about a future market. It is about the investment opportunities, first mover opportunity that Africa presents for American countries that want to position themselves for the next growth continent.
Well, why did he choose Angola as the focus of his visit in Africa?
So the Lobito Corridor Project in Angola represents, depending on who you look at, 800 billion to a trillion US dollar investment by a variety of partners. Sorry, 800 million to a billion investment in Africa. It's the largest infrastructure project in engagement by the US in Africa in many, many years. And it's the first time that we see the Americans really, in a sense, directly competing with the Chinese on infrastructure in Africa. So this is a showcase for the Americans and for the Europeans, because it also involves some EU funding, of their ability to compete against China in establishing a corridor which will, in theory, take critical minerals to the West Coast. But in actual fact, when you look at what the Chinese are doing on the Dar es Salaam railway line, you are establishing a railway line across the whole of southern Africa. And that provides an opportunity for Africa. And it also provides, in the case of the Lobito Corridor, there is a commitment by the Americans to also try and industrialize and build local capacity for beneficiation, which is quite different to how the Chinese are seeing this. So it's a showcase. It's important for Angola, for Zambia, for the DRC, for South Africa, and of course, eventually also for Tanzania, when you look at the east-west line that the railway will cross.
Should we read anything into President Biden not visiting South Africa? Because South Africa is a powerhouse in Southern Africa, and that he instead chose Angola. Is that a snub because of the recent tension that there was because South Africa is supporting some of the rogue states?
I think Biden politically would have had a problem coming to South Africa, given South Africa's position on what's happening in Israel. But I don't think that was the major consideration. The Lobito project and the hype around that's what this is all about. And right from the beginning, this was going to be a short visit, lame duck presidency. It reflects Africa's limited position in terms of American politics. I don't think it's being read as a snub, but I think he would have had a problem had he decided to come to South Africa. The pro-Israeli lobby in the US would have given him no end of problem.
Well, how do you see this going forward? South Africa's, particularly its foreign policy and the new administration.
Well, South Africa, in a sense, is lucky in that we now have a government of national unity. And that government of national unity means that our foreign policy positions, which have been stridently anti-Israeli, have been moderated to a degree, not only there, but on a variety of other issues. So this provides, so if you want to tell, for the Americans, if you want to get behind change, then kicking South Africa out of AGOA is just at the wrong time. Basically, from their point of view, which would be a pro-business, sort of pro-DA kind of position, it would be supporting South Africa, supporting change in South Africa, or as I would put it, the normalization of South African politics and the move away from sort of the liberation era politics that we've seen, where our interests are more aligned with our economic developmental interests and not ideological, which has been very much a hallmark of South African foreign policy under the ANC. So in that sense, the government of national unity maybe gives us a get out of jail ticket.
So, what about the rest of Africa? How should they position themselves for the Trump administration?
I think Africans, it's interesting that while many of us are quite critical of Trump and his politics and his ethics or lack thereof, the situation in many African countries is quite pro-Trump amongst large sections of the population, because they see a president who is really committed to his country. I would almost say, damn the consequences. And I'm always surprised by the extent to which I would expect sort of universal condemnation of Trump, but that is actually not true. And then a country like Angola is actually quite pro the US, interestingly enough, given its history. Same with a country like Kenya, Morocco, and so on. So Africa is not united in being pro-Chinese or pro or anti-American. The positions on the continent are quite diverse. But Africa has to be careful, because what would happen is that Trump will act in America's interests. For example, there has been speculation for example, agreed to recognize Morocco's control over the Western Sahara in exchange for Morocco recognizing the existence of Israel, and that. So those kind of transactional arrangements could really become a problem for Africa. There is talk that Trump may agree to recognize the independence of Somaliland, which would be the first time that its independence is acknowledged. And that would be a huge, that would unlock real challenges for Africa because thus far, no African country has recognized Somaliland. And of course, Ethiopia has an agreement with Somaliland for a port. And the story is that this may provide a vehicle for the Americans to establish a military base that is not in Djibouti. All kinds of complicated geopolitical issues. But that's the kind of disruptors that I think we would need to watch very carefully. Nobody knows what's going to happen because the one thing that we can say with that we can be certain about is that we don't know what Trump is going to do.